Today I'm speaking with Ron Lindsay. Ron is a lawyer, a philosopher, and he has served as a president and CEO of the Center for Inquiry. He is the author of several books, including Future Bioethics and The Necessity of Secularism. His most recent book, which we'll be talking about today, is Against the New Politics of Identity. Ron, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So what inspired you to write this new book, Against the New Politics of Identity? And it has a bit of a long-winded subtitle, which I'll go ahead and read. It is How the Left's Dogma on Race and Equity Harm Liberal Democracy and Invigorate Christian Nationalism. So there's a lot there. That almost spells out the whole thesis for the book. But yeah, what inspired you to jump into this kind of inflammatory topic?
Kind of an inflammatory topic. Well, because I believe that liberal democracy is under assault from both the left and the right. In fact, the original title for this book was Dogmas Left and Right. But the publisher thought that sounded like it was going to be too even-handed and, kind of middle of the road or whatever. So we changed this to somewhat more inflammatory title, as you indicate. In fact, there are matchsticks on the cover. That was the publisher's idea. At any rate, I do think so. I guess having said that, maybe I should define or at least indicate what I believe liberal democracy entails. I think a cornerstone of liberal democracy is respect for individual rights. And all that means in terms of, obviously, right to free speech, right to be judged on one's merits, right to have one's voice treated as equal as that of others, obviously the right to decide what one wants to believe about religious matters, etc. And I think those core principles that undergird liberal democracy, as I say, are under attack from both the left and the right. In my book, I concentrate, there are like 4 substantive chapters. 3 of the 4 chapters are devoted to what I regard as dogmas of the left. I do that because I think to a large extent they've been unexamined, certainly by mainstream media outlets. In fact, those dogmas to some extent are accepted by mainstream media. I don't know if you saw, there was a recent article just came to light the other day from someone who's working at NPR that talked about, of course, the liberal slant of NPR has long been known, but this went into more detail about how exactly ideological conformity is imposed on the staffers and on the articles that they put on the radio or they publish on their website. So as I said, to me, I don't know if that's the biggest threat, because I do think the threat from the right can be equally dangerous. But as I say, the threat from the left has not been examined as much. And the 3 dogmas or sets of dogmas that I attack coming from the left, first of all, you have this standpoint theory, the theory that there's no such thing as objective knowledge. And kind of a corollary from that, existing somewhat in tension with the idea that there's no objective knowledge, is the idea that marginalized people, oppressed people, have special insight, especially when it concerns their lived experience, and we have to defer to them. They're kind of essentially creating 2 different castes in terms of how we have knowledge. Then, of course, you have the claim that we must pursue equity as it's now defined. That is social engineering to bring out equal outcomes to identity groups. Not everyone realizes this. This was actually the first executive order of the Biden administration, saying that across the federal government, equity was going to be a primary goal. And they had like a laundry list of every conceivable equity, identity group you can think of, race, ethnicity, disability groups, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the list went on and on. And of course, one rationale for the pursuit of equity is this idea that there's systemic racism in the country. And again, this is something that's accepted by many liberal institutions, not just the media, by universities, corporations who've, of course, adopted diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, DEI initiatives, to promote the idea among their workplace that there is systemic racism and we must combat that. All 3 of these sets of ideas, I think, have been largely unexamined, at least by the liberal segments of society. And I think once they are examined, they don't withstand scrutiny. And then on the right, I attack the idea also kind of tied to the sense of group identity as being paramount. It's the sense that we have a Christian identity as a nation. This is certainly, I think, a key component of the so-called MAGA coalition. In fact, I think recently in his campaign, Trump has harped more on this than he actually did in the past. This idea that we have to pursue a Christian identity for this nation, because at least historically that they claim that's how we were founded as a Christian nation. So in my last chapter of my book, I kind of examined that thesis in detail, especially looking at the historical claim, and they essentially show that it's unfounded. We were founded as a secular republic, and all you have to do is look at the Constitution actually to find that out. So I think that's essentially the quick overview of the book. Obviously, for all these different topics, I went into a lot of research. One thing I'm proud of, I did actually spend about a year researching the book, and I think I have something like over 600 endnotes, providing support for the various arguments I give.
So most books that I've seen that are related to this, they will either take the left or the right, and they will gripe about one of them, and that will be their main focus. What I like about your book is that you do dedicate a lot of time to both of them. One question that I have is, how much do you think the excesses of the left and the right feed off of each other and encourage each other? And one data point in my mind is that when Trump came into office, a lot of people thought, oh, this is good because he is going to stamp down the excesses on the left, and they're going to be less dangerous in a sense for their illiberal instincts of the left will be tamped down. Instead, it seems like the opposite happened, where he just completely made the left lose its mind even more. And I mean, all the issues that people talk about with the excesses of the left, he just made people, even more extreme, it seems like. So at what extent do you think that these two extremes are playing off of each other, and how interrelated are they?
Yeah, you hit it nail on the head, I think, and it's kind of like a spiral. I mean, they're exacerbating each other's worst tendencies, and creating, I think, a lot of division in society. And it tends to make people, align on one side or the other, pushing some, at least in each camp, to the extremes. And I think that the unfortunate result of that is we don't have enough people willing to kind of critically look at the ideas being put forth by each side and find out, what may be a kernel of truth in some of it, and what unfortunately is just, it's just nonsense to some extent, and certainly unsupported factual claims. So yes, I think you're quite right. I think, frankly, and I'm not a Trump supporter for a number of reasons we can get into later if necessary, but I think there was an overreaction to some of the stuff he did. And frankly, some, and I know people do this in politics all the time, right? They want to get a political advantage. They tend to exaggerate or distort what people say. I'm thinking, for example, of the whole, Charlottesville incident, which was obviously very regrettable. And people portrayed Trump as somehow supporting some of the excesses that were carried out by some of these far-right groups. I don't think he did that at all, frankly. And again, I'm not a Trump supporter, but they turned it around. And, Biden, in fact, has indicated that he used the whole Charlottesville incident as the inspiration for his deciding to run. I don't know if I guess we take him at his word. I think that was kind of an overreaction. And again, during the whole Trump, term of his presidency, I think it did invigorate some of the more extreme elements of, especially of identity politics. And of course, you had the George Floyd incident, which kind of set the whole thing, on hyperspeed, and that really led, there already was at the time some push to, put this theory of systemic racism in schools and universities and in, corporations. But the George Floyd thing really gave a lot of impetus to that. If colleges didn't have DEI programs before, they quickly adopted that. Same thing with major corporations. And now, of course, I think people are, especially in the last couple of years, you've seen a reaction to some of the excesses that, from the left. People are beginning to recognize how counterproductive many of these DEI programs are. And as you probably know, I mean, some universities now have abandoned them under pressure, but they've abandoned them. I think Texas A&M, I think, is probably the prime example of that. And there's been criticism. Even interesting, the New York Times has from time to time published articles about how DEI may be being misused by universities. They had an article not too long ago, I think it was someone in the fall, talking about how UCLA, and they're certainly not alone among universities now requiring applicants for faculty positions. You have to specify how you support DEI efforts, what your understanding of DEI efforts are. And if you make the mistake of saying something like, well, I think all individuals should be treated the same, boom, that's oh my God, you can't be hired. How can you say that? People should be treated the same. We have to give preferential treatment to certain marginalized groups or whatever. And again, as I said, they had ran this article. I can't forget the applicant's name, but he had been critical of some aspects of DEI, and just on that basis, he was refused a position. And as I say, so people are now reacting to that. I know I see from time to time, people have said, oh, well, DEI is dead. I don't think it's dead. It just maybe been slowed down a bit. But I think it's clear that those who support that are repositioning it. In fact, even they're thinking, I've seen this, thinking of other names for it. Kind of the same program, but with different clothing, if you will, trying to cover it. So I think we're going to see this go back and forth. And unfortunately, I think, again, it's become, this whole set of issues have become so divisive. It's preventing people from taking a step back and just kind of looking at, the arguments on both sides and finding, where it's gone wrong, but also, indicating maybe there's, some kernel of truth to it. I think, like, for example, DEI programs, the idea that somehow we should get people to understand, for example, some of the history of the country that has been, in fact, obscured. Certainly a lot of people didn't know, for example, about the ways in which, especially in the 20s and 30s, blacks were shut out of jobs, how there were, racial riots against blacks. I'm all in favor of teaching that history, but it's one thing to teach factual history, but then spin it and put it under some, ideological program which, pushes the idea that white supremacy somehow is the root of all evil in all aspects of our life. Clearly an exaggeration and, without foundation.
There's this book that I really like by the author Julia Galef, and it came out a couple of years ago. And she talked about this concept of identity and how it's become widespread and everywhere. She makes the case that we can't just abandon our identity. We all have identities. We all totally know them. We recognize them. And that's how we form groups with each other. And it's kind of normal and kind of boring. But she makes the case that we should hold our identities lightly. Acknowledge them, but hold them lightly. And when we make our whole worldview based around our identity, then all of a sudden it becomes highly toxic and corrosive to society. How do you feel about that? And what is your relationship to identity? How do you think that we have a healthy identity?
Well, no question, we have an identity of sorts, and that's certainly not inconsistent. In fact, in the book, I contrast kind of the old idea of identity politics with just that, obviously people have affinities with certain groups. You want to make sure that your group's interests are heard, get a seat at the table. Nothing wrong with that. We've had for centuries, not centuries, certainly within the last century, we've had a lot of different groups fostering their interests, whether it's the, NAACP, the American Legion, the Catholic League, you have the unions and what have you. Nothing wrong with that at all. The problem with the new identity politics is that they're not only demanding a seat at the table, but they want to exclude other identity groups from that table, right? Especially the groups that they think somehow are at, the cause of many, if not all, the problems we have in society, which usually translates to whites or white males. This whole idea of white supremacy has now become it's like almost it's a secular analog to the devil or something. People used to blame the devil for everything. Now it's white supremacy. It's amazing. I mean, one of the eye-opening things when I did the research for the book is how much this idea has inserted itself in areas where you might think you wouldn't have expected it. I'm thinking now of the medical community. I was actually shocked by how much the medical community, and by that I mean, for example, the American Medical Association, medical schools across the country, have embraced this idea that white supremacy is the cause of health problems. And coupled with, of course, things that they say are outgrowths of white supremacy, such as this idea of meritocracy, capitalism. All these are tools of oppression. According to the American Medical Association, an organization that used to be regarded as too conservative, quite the opposite now. And that has translated into how physicians are now being educated. Many medical schools now have mandatory courses on racism and white supremacy, systemic racism. And it used to be the emphasis on medical training was how to treat the individual patient. Now they essentially have become social justice warriors. The emphasis is on what they regard as changing the structure of society. And I think that bodes ill for the medical profession. Certainly, I think, there's been enough distrust of the medical establishment, especially over recent years with all the controversies about vaccines and COVID and what have you. And now if people get the idea that when they see the physician, they're not being treated as an individual, but rather the physician is seeing them as some kind of cog in some greater machine, and he has to consider all the equities of various groups in deciding how to treat the patient, I'm not sure that's a way to engender trust in physicians. But anyway, as I said, that was one of the more surprising things when I looked into this book, is how much that whole notion that white supremacy, capitalism, meritocracy are all evils and cause oppression, how that's infiltrated the medical community.
That is very fascinating. When I was growing up in school and just everywhere, I was trained, for lack of a better word, to treat all people equally and see all people equally. And this just has always seemed very obvious to me. And so when the left takes its turn to seeing everyone not as an individual, but as just a group, it does strike me as just kind of gross. And I don't like looking at humanity like that. Like, that person, I have to look at them first by their skin color or their sex or some other, characteristic before I look at them as just like another human. That to me, it does just turn me off by the way that I was raised. And part of my concern is that people who might even be apolitical or like aren't on the extreme left, but young people are just grown up in this world where they have to first and foremost look at another person as, oh, you belong to these group identities, before they look at them as an individual. And I'm worried that there's this sort of indoctrination that's happening because of the school system, et cetera. Like, what do you think about that?
Oh, that's true. I mean, and again, it's unfortunately, it's widespread among many universities. Again, a lot of the courses that are being taught at universities now emphasize what they regard as, systemic racism, structural racism, white supremacy, and that obviously has an effect, I think, on how, students are now beginning to perceive other people. It carries over, obviously, into, self-censorship. Many students feel that they can't really express their views because they think, well, if I say something that may question some of the things that are being said by the professor, I'll be accused of being racist. I certainly don't want to be accused of being racist, so I'll just keep quiet, right? And there's just, this whole encouragement. And again, as I said in the past, we've had, groups that have come together to try to foster interests when they had common interests. They want to make sure that their voices are heard. But now there's almost like a wall, between different groups. Like, you either have to be a part of this, this black group or this Hispanic group or some other, Muslim group or what have you. you're divided into these different silos, and I think it's actually cutting down, communication that would be helpful in getting people to understand each other's perspective. So I think it's a very unhealthy trend.
Race relations were getting significantly better up until I think like the early 2000s. And then something happened where they got markedly worse. I know that a lot of people blame the internet for this because all of a sudden, one incidence of like police violence against a black person becomes viral, and then that's just so stuck in our minds. And then we just see these happening more and more with like people taking cell phone videos. What do you think the cause is that we've become more divided racially in recent years?
Well, there are probably a multiplicity of causes. One, as you say, is the internet and how we now get our news from the internet, and how even more, I mean, all media, because they want to get readers to some extent, play up stories that have sensational value. But I think it's more true of social media, because they want to get, attention quickly. They have, short bites, don't go into a lot of factual details. So you just get the kind of, very essence of some story. And again, because they don't go into background, don't provide, details, especially, statistics about, really, how often is it that, for example, unarmed blacks are shot by police? If you just rely on internet stories, you get this idea, and that's proven by surveys. People will say, wow, it's like 10,000, blacks are being killed a year by police or something. And of course, the answer is, quite to the contrary. It's like maybe a dozen or so each year. And in fact, of course, in terms of absolute numbers, the number of whites who are killed by police each year still outnumber the number of blacks. Of course, the counter argument is that, well, you have to look at percentages, and since blacks are 13% of the population, if it turns out that 30% of the people shot by police are blacks, somehow that shows discrimination. But that, of course, doesn't take into account that the number of violent crimes proportionally are carried out more by blacks than whites. Not because of any inherent racial thing, but it tends to be the case, I think, proven throughout human history. People who are poor tend to commit more crimes because they need the money, whatever it is they need the money for, whether it's drug habits or just to support themselves. And therefore, you may have segments of the population that proportionally maybe have less resources turning to crime, and therefore they encounter police more often. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with race or racist cops. And again, the numbers are greatly exaggerated. And you hear this talk, which is very loose, and I understand why people do it because they have their motivations for doing it. But trying to think of the name of the civil rights attorney who I think turns up at every police shooting, it seems, Ben Crump. On many occasions he's talked about, there's a genocide against, blacks in this country by the police. Well, the numbers just don't bear that out. I mean, again, in terms of unarmed black individuals, the numbers are, 10 to 12 each year. And, the percentage of blacks, I actually figured out the number in my book. I can't quote it, but it's something like 0.00087% of black individuals are shot by the police each year. So it's hardly a genocide. Every time there's a police incident now, there's an accusation of racism. And the thing is, if you look at each case individually, sometimes you can say, yeah, there may have been a racist motive involved, other times not. I think one of the most famous cases that kind of started this trend, at least in recent years, the Michael Brown case back from Ferguson. People, I think, have forgotten that the Obama Justice Department actually looked into that and found out there was no basis for, claiming there was any racism involved in this incident. The facts seem to indicate that this gentleman, in fact, did attack the police officer in question, did try to, grab his gun. Police officer defended himself, and unfortunately, the result ended in the death of Michael Brown. But that led to, protests and riots, what have you. On the other hand, you took a look at the George Floyd incident. It seems pretty clear to me, yeah, there was excessive violence, excessive force used in that case. he's now been made into some kind of martyr and emblem of the whole idea of, violence against police. But, looking at it objectively, I think there was excessive force used, and, and punishment there was appropriate for at least the one police officer who was directly involved. But, all these cases tend to be blended together, and generalizations are made that I think are unsupported.
Yeah, this is just what bugs me about the left. If I could just put my finger on it, speaking as someone who's on the left, it bugs me that Roland Fryer came out with his study about police shootings and black men, and it was counterintuitive. He found what he did not expect to find, that police didn't actually go out of their way to shoot black men, which is what the narrative of the day was. And rather than everyone just accepting that and grappling with it and changing their priors and trying to say, okay, now we have a new set of data and now we can go forward with this, the left, effectively chased him out of Harvard University, and he was anathema on the left for quite some time because of this excellent study that he did. That is, to me, just it's so frustrating that the left is like that. And the reason that I have in my mind for why the left can do that, I expect better of the left, again, coming from the left, is that there's an ideology there, right? And you put your finger on this too with, let me just read them off again. You have these three fundamental changes you think that have taken place on the left. One is the growing acceptance of standpoint theory, the embrace of the doctrine of systemic racism, and 3, the view that equity must take precedence over selection criteria. And you call this a new orthodoxy. And so there is this ideology on the left. Talk to me a little bit about the power of ideology, why even secular people always, or, unfortunately so frequently fall for some sort of an ideology.
I think because it's an organizing principle for your viewpoints, and it's something that it's a lot easier to accept a general explanation and say, well, I can apply that general explanation to these different cases and that takes care of my understanding of it. It happened because of this overarching set of principles, rather than spending the time to look at each case individually. That requires some effort. You have to, spend a little bit of time looking into the facts of each case if you want to evaluate each case individually. So there's a temptation to do that. And then there's just this idea again. We talked before about how America, unfortunately, to some extent at least, has been divided into these different camps. And there's a sense that somehow to prove your loyalty to a particular camp, you tended to be left in the past. Well, this seems now to be the viewpoint of the left, the identity politics. I guess I should go along with that. That's what, the newspapers I read, that's what they're saying. My friends at the university, this is what they're embracing. So I think I'll go along with that. And a somewhat similar, counterpart, I think you get on the right as well. Trump is an amazing, effective politician, because I think, people claim he's stupid or whatever. I don't think he's stupid. I think he's a very cunning politician. I think he knows how to, hit the right buttons. There's this, sense. I think there are legitimate grievances that people have on the right because they're concerned about some of the excesses on the left, and he knows how to manipulate that sense of grievance and get them motivated to support him. Whether, overall that's the best course of action, that's a different question. But, again, people tend to, gravitate toward, this group sense that, I'm concerned about these things. He's voicing some of my concerns, and well, yeah, he's got these issues of, maybe not being the most.
Trump has issues. What?
Yeah, temperate person or qualified and shooting from the hip and exaggerating, and the whole January 6th thing, whatever. But he's standing up for me. I think the most effective slogan he's had, and he's used this number of times now, is "They're not after me. They're after you. I'm just standing in the way." And
I think that's a good slogan. Yeah,
that's a good slogan. Whoever devised that for him should get a bonus. They probably have. I think that resonates with a lot of people.
So I definitely want to pick on the right. I want to spend some time on that. I have 2 more quick questions about picking on the left, though. The first is, what do you make of the claim by Peter Boghossian and some other folks that this new leftist ideology. It's become like wokeism is a religion, I guess, is what Peter Boghossian has said many times. What do you think about that as like applying the word religion to wokeism?
Well, first of all, I guess I'm a little reluctant to embrace that because just for constitutional law purposes, I've always wanted to make the point that an essential element of religion is a belief in something supernatural. In fact, I think that's the only way you can consistently distinguish religion from, secular ideologies. Now, what they do have in common is this sense of certainty, the sense that there's essentially a dogma out there that I can't question. So it is true that among some on the left, they are simply unwilling to consider evidence that might be contrary to their viewpoint. Whether it's, systemic racism, which, as I point out in my book, is largely still unexamined. It's just accepted, and, white supremacy, et cetera, that's the explanation for a lot of things. So, as I said, this idea that there is a set of principles that you can't question, that is something that these secular, ideologies do share with religion to some extent. You want to call it a religion? I mean, there are analogies, so I can see why they want to do that.
Original sin, I guess, like being white is original sin. People
sin, right? Yeah, and the idea, I've seen this, and I think to some extent I agree with this. We've talked about this idea of lived experience somehow gives you a special status. It is kind of maybe a secular analog to the idea of prophetic revelation, where this prophet has this channel to God and says something, and you really can't question it. Well, likewise, if the black person says they've been discriminated against, well, you can't question it, right? That's their lived experience. Yeah, you can kind of stretch it that way, but I still think there are some key differences between it. But I can understand why that analogy is made. I mean, I think the key point is to focus on is, just like some religious people are unwilling to question their beliefs at all, would just dismiss contrary evidence, and say, well, that's blasphemy, or you shouldn't say that. Yeah, there's some of that tendency among, the identity left as well. That no,
that's
you can't.
A good point. Yeah.
If you're trying to question systemic racism, well, you're a racist. It's like, if you question religion, you're a blasphemer or a heretic or something like that. So
you'll be kicked out of the community for saying.
You're kicked out of the community, exactly, right.
Okay, so my last question against the left is the claim made in the book is that the excesses of the left, this new orthodoxy, would lead to the downfall of liberal democracy, or would very seriously damage liberal democracy. Spell out for me how exactly that works. How is this just excess of the left caring too much about identity politics, or to gloss over it? How could that lead to the end result of liberal democracy being harmed?
So all the three dogmas I've identified in terms of lived experience taking priority, equity, the social engineering bring out equal outcomes, and this idea of systemic racism, especially as it divides people into kind of conflicting groups, all those I think tend to undercut the key principles of liberal democracy. One of the things that I think are the cornerstone of liberal democracy is not just free speech, but free inquiry. And we've seen increasingly over the last number of years now censorship of scientific inquiry. First of all, to get scientific positions, you now have to subscribe in many cases to these diversity statements. But it goes beyond that. At scientific conferences and in scientific journals, they are, excluding studies that tend to undercut prevailing dogmas about, racism or what have you. To get papers accepted at some conferences, and I cite this in my book, I forgot the exact name of the conference, I think it was a sociological conference, you had to indicate in what way your paper helps to promote diversity and equity. Various scientific journals have now said they're going to refuse to publish articles that they think somehow insult the dignity of marginalized groups. So in other words, you could have a study that actually is well-founded based on, let's say, it's the study about criminology. But if somehow it indicates that, well, blacks are being sent to prison more often because they more often commit felonies, maybe that's going to be rejected because that, undercuts the dignity of some marginalized group. All those things have a corrosive effect. But probably the most corrosive effect is this drive for equity and how it's being pushed. First of all, I question it as whether that's a proper goal, but it's certainly a goal that I think will undercut, our economic progress, our rights as individuals. The people who are pushing equity wanted it across the board in all areas, and that includes, for example, there have been pushes. There's actually legislation in Congress to require the Federal Reserve to have as one of its goals to bring about equity among social groups. You can see how that's going to skew our economy, and result in, I think, essentially type of social engineering that socialist countries used to have for different reasons. And so it's not going to be like a sudden collapse or anything. And as I say, it's compared to a slow rot. It's going to eat away at the underpinnings of our liberal democracy. And again, this the fundamental idea that's driving all this is that the individual somehow has to be subordinate to group identity. And I think that goes against the very founding principles of the liberal democracy in our country and liberal democracy in European countries. The idea that it's the individual that is the unit of moral concern, not a group. So in that sense, right. I think it poses a threat. Again, not an immediate threat, but I think over a long term, it will be a threat to liberal democracy.
Now, on the right, there's a threat of Christian nationalism and just a lot of, I think, just plain wackadoos who become powerful on the right. And so the scariness on the right is more obvious to me, just because you see people just saying crazy things and everyone just still on the right, just still applauding for them. Like they jumped the shark in such an obvious way to me that it's not even comparable. But So Matt Taibbi will say that he focuses on the problems of the left because they hold all the institutions of power. They control Hollywood, they control the news media, etc. How do you weigh this slow corrosiveness of the left's extremes against the idea that the right is, let's just say, they have authoritarian bents right now, and they're totally down to go for the authoritarian leader, strongman type figure. Yeah. Maybe someone will argue that that's just my liberal bias speaking, but let's play that out. Like, how do you weigh those two concerns?
It is a concern. As I point out in my book, I'm concerned by equal things, and I think we're the right to triumph. We're the authoritarian right to triumph. The Trump, authoritarian right. It would lead to an immediate collapse of liberal democracy. I mean, the bottom line is, again, people characterize the events of January 6th different. It was a riot, insurrection. I'm not sure it was an insurrection, but certainly he inflamed a mob to attack the Capitol, and he clearly was trying by various means, not just what happened on January 6th, to overturn the results of a democratic election, which is, kind of the minimum you want as, for the guy who wants to be president, that they respect, results of an election. And he's made it clear that if he comes into power, he's going to use his office to try to, cut back on what I think are some, key freedoms. He's talked about, using the Justice Department to persecute individuals that he thinks were after him. So I think, again, it's hard to figure out exactly how serious Trump is on occasion, but I think you have to take him at his word when he talks about what his plans are, and his plans clearly are inconsistent with a liberal democracy. When he's talking about dismissing the civil service as it exists now and putting people in who would just follow his lead on politics. Again, that's essentially would destroy the idea of an independent, objective civil service. using the Justice Department to further his own ends. Yeah, I mean that's a clear threat to liberal democracy. He's hinted, of course, now that if presumably, I don't know, who knows what's going to happen. He may very well win this election. I mean, the polls indicate right now he's ahead. But if he doesn't win, he certainly suggested that there's going to be violence. All those things are very concerning. So yeah, I think there definitely is a threat from the right. They've indicated if they get into power, they are going to try to, at least the Christian nationalist wing of the right, and they're certainly not all of the right, but they're a powerful segment of the right, try to enforce what they perceive as their Christian norms. You know, people debate what Christianity actually entails, but their idea of Christianity, they're going to try to impose that on the country. They're going to try to roll back the idea of, certainly, of course, the abortion is a key example, but also the idea of same-sex marriage. They want to get rid of that, try to roll back that if possible, and essentially impose on the nation their idea of, what a Christian nation should look like. But yeah, I do see that as a threat. And again, it would be more of an immediate threat if, in fact, the authoritarian right were to come to power, because I think they would try to impose their agenda fairly quickly. Now, would they be successful? How much resistance there would be? Difficult to say. Again, Trump has indicated he's going to use the various levers of power that he would have at his disposal, including perhaps using, the military to try to enforce his views of things. Yeah. I mean, if he's serious about that, that's definitely a matter for concern.
Ben Shapiro has semi-famously said that he's not worried about Trump coming into office again, despite all of his bad tendencies, because it will be his 8th year as president. And then there is the constitutional limit. It's very clear. No one can dispute it, and he will be out. I can personally think up some kind of, scary reasons why that might not be the case. I could see him pulling strings to make Trump Jr., become or he could have someone as his puppet and he effectively stays as king. There are ways that I think that it could happen. Sure. It is very speculative, but maybe speaking to you as a lawyer, do you have any thoughts on that? Do you have any insights into how he might?
I mean, the way that, at least nominally, he would respect the Constitution is just to put in some puppet. I mean, look at what Putin did with Medvedev, right? Mm-hmm. Putin, at least nominally, wanted to respect the Russian Constitution at the time, and I think was it 2012 or whatever. Anyway, he was term limited, just like our president is. I think he could only have 2 successive terms. So he put in Medvedev as his, as the president, as a puppet. But it was clear that Putin was calling the shots. Mm-hmm. And of course, now they've changed the Constitution so that Putin can continue. I can see a scenario like that playing out, that whether it's Don Jr. or some other acolyte for Trump being put in the office and carrying on his policies with Trump, calling the shots. And then maybe even an effort, depending how popular he gets and whether he can suppress the votes of others, maybe even change the Constitution to allow him to have another term. One, I don't know, should I say it's a good thing, but I mean, one obvious limit there is that, I mean, he is just like Biden. I mean, he's getting up there in years. So at some point, I would think that just physically, he may not be able to carry on. And of course, death comes to all of us. It may come to him at some point in his 80s. So he won't be able to carry on. But there'll be people like him who have the same mindset, maybe without the devoted cult following that he has managed to inculcate. Therefore, maybe not as powerful. But there'll be people of the same ideological ilk that will seek to carry on his programs. Yeah.
So Trump goes away. Let's just say maybe tomorrow and maybe 10 years from now, but Trump goes away. What does that do to the movement on the right, the Christian nationalism movement, or any of the excesses of the right? And this is an interesting question because there's kind of no parallel question on the left. There's no Bernie Sanders dies, so what happens to the left movement? I mean, nothing. It keeps going. But Trump seems like he seems like the figurehead, and he doesn't have a successor, I don't think. I don't know, like play that out for me. What happens with the
Well,
right?
I think it would definitely be weakened. He's definitely a unifying figure. He has, again, I think he's a very cunning politician, and he's managed to tap into the concerns and grievances, I think to some extent legitimate grievances that people have, and to manipulate them. There's no clear successor on the horizon. I mean, they're clearly wannabes. People like Josh Hawley, for example, in Missouri comes to mind, Tom Cotton in Arkansas. Whether they would have the same sort of ability to unify the far right, including the elements that may want authoritarian government, I don't think so. I just don't think they're going to have the same sort of appeal, which could mean that this threat, real as it is, could be short-lived unless Trump gets to power and somehow it manages to establish, get a foundation for the authoritarian right that allows them to carry on even when he's gone from the scene. That's possible. But you're right. I mean, if he were to lose this election, and somehow we manage to quell or contain whatever disruptions happen as a result of that, the immediate threat from the authoritarian right, I think, would definitely recede. But you're right, and to some extent. So we both talked about the threats from the left and the right, and they both are threats, but in different ways. And the left, as you say, it's more diffuse, and to some extent, you could say, well, because of that, in the long term, it could be more dangerous because it's now entrenched in so many different institutions, in universities, to some extent, even in corporations, in organizations like the American Medical Association, to some extent, not quite the same as AMA, but also the American Bar Association. Groups that have a great deal of influence throughout society, and therefore, because it's not tied to any one or two particular figures, I think it's here to stay for a while. Again, unless people wake up to it, try to recognize what a danger it is and try to combat it effectively. And there's some signs that it is being rolled back to some extent in some areas. Again, the way Texas A&M has got rid of DEI programs, the way that even some institutions like the New York Times, that obviously generally skews left and has been identified to some extent, especially staffers with the identity left, they at least from time to time now have been publishing articles that question some of the dogmas on the left. One other example, which we haven't talked about a bit, is the whole trans thing. Now, as a classical liberal person, I'm all in favor of autonomy. So people want to transition, adults want to transition. I'm all in favor of that. I mean, it's up to them, essentially. And I've known people who transition. They seem happy with that. Fine with me. I don't really care. It doesn't affect me. And I'm happy for them if that works out for them. But, the ideology has taken such a hold that if you even question certain aspects of it, somehow you become transphobic. And the key example, of course, is the athletic example, where it's just a matter of biological reality that if you've been a male for a significant part of your life through adolescence and what have you, that testosterone is going to give you an advantage in many athletic competitions over people who are biologically women. And it's just a fact. It's not being it's just a biological fact. And maybe different athletic bodies want to treat it differently, but the idea that somehow, well, maybe we should put some regulations and if restrict, if not, completely prohibit, people who transition from male to female from participating in female sports. It's certainly something we should could reasonably debate, but just the idea of bringing that up now for some on the left who bought into this old trans ideology, again, it makes you they say, well, you're transphobic and you're hurting people, you're driving people to suicide if you bring this up. It's just I think it's unfortunate. Again,
on that topic, it is the left again, just dropping the ball in terms of not actually reading scientific studies and not applying concepts that we know are universal, like social contagion. Like we know social contagion is a thing, but for this one particular issue on the left, people pretend like social contagion doesn't apply to transgenderism, which, I mean, of course it does. It applies to anything. It applies to like clothes teens wear or pizza that they like,
Sure,
anything. But we have to pretend like, no, it doesn't apply here. It's like, okay, all right.
Yeah.
So I have just two more quick questions. I recently spoke with Tracing Woodgrains, and he wrote this really fascinating article about how even though there is this kind of powerful movement on the right, it's really interesting when you look into who has power on the right, who has like the boring but the powerful jobs, who are the lawyers in the institutions. They're all actually kind of people on the left, because people on the left are so much more people come out of universities and they come out of law schools being just more liberal. That's just kind of like a fact that people on the right just need to kind of sort of grapple with. And so this is maybe why Trump has such a hard time getting a very competent lawyer, or why very conservative organizations have a hard time getting staff, is because there just aren't that many people with high degrees who are conservative. I started out as conservative. I went to college and I became a liberal. Like, it's like, sorry, everyone who's conservative, but that happened to me. I don't know. I'm a data point there. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that, about how for some reason people go to college and they become more liberal, and then even if there is a conservative institution and it's semi-powerful, it might actually be run by liberals? What do you think about that concept?
Well, I think, there is certainly, and polls bear this out, college does tend to make people more liberal, and especially actually the more education you have. So if you go to graduate school, that tendency is even more pronounced. I think there are good reasons for that, and maybe some reasons that in the long run are not that good, or reflect certain things that maybe are not beneficial to society. Looking at my own experience, for example, I don't think it's uncommon. I was very dogmatic when I was young. I mean, I was raised as a strict Catholic. I was actually at one time thinking of becoming a priest. Even was accepted at a seminary in Rome. But anyway, I went to Georgetown, and it taught me how to think critically. Georgetown, actually, one was the irony is I picked Georgetown because I wanted to go to a Catholic school. I had a brother who went to MIT, and he came back with all these crazy ideas about how Jesus wasn't God and all that. I was, I don't want to go to either of these schools. I'm just going to, right? But I became an atheist at Georgetown, in part because, and I congratulate the Jesuits for this, they taught us how to think critically, and I think that happens at many good schools. Unfortunately, now I think you still get that at some schools, and even at schools maybe they're identified as far left with some professors. But I think now the unfortunate and countervailing tendency is that, right, they'll get you maybe to question some of your beliefs that you've accepted about American exceptionalism or whatever, but then they go to other extremes and now talk about how white supremacy is the cause for these evils and there's systemic racism or whatever. So you get not so much fostering critical thinking and open-mindedness, but just trading one set of dogmas for another. So I think you have both those tendencies that are appearing in colleges, both at the undergraduate and graduate level. And I think both those tendencies can explain why maybe on the right you don't get as many people who have, the college degrees, graduate degrees, or what have you. But, they have enough of them. Let's say, they are able to carry on. And of course, that's the explanation of why some on the right have established their own universities and colleges, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on where this all leads? And are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future in terms of us being a cohesive nation that gets along?
I guess I am mildly optimistic, just in the sense I think people tend to be resilient, and over time, the extremes tend to get modified and fall away in terms of their influence. But that's not inevitable. I mean, it could happen the other way. So I guess I'm hopeful, is probably a better way than saying optimistic. I'm hopeful that, first of all, and again, I know I'm an advisor for Atheists for Liberty, and the Atheists for Liberty is, of course, nonpartisan. It definitely doesn't take positions. For speaking for me personally, I don't want to see Trump to win, because I think, again, the short-term danger is from Trump, bringing in authoritarian tendencies into our government. But I'm not crazy about the left either, especially Biden with his whole equity agenda. And I think if Biden does win, I hope that there'll be resistance to some of the ideas that he's been pushing, and that some in his administration are pushing. And if that happens, if some of the, tendencies now that there are trends, of pushing DEI, if there can be some continuing pushback on that, and people can see some of the problems with that, problems with the equity agenda, people can begin to question maybe some of the claims, some of the more outrageous claims that have been made for systemic racism. Maybe we get back on a more of an even keel. If that doesn't happen, as I said, I'm concerned that there will be this slow rot, and slow eating away of the principles underlying our liberal democracy, including the respect for individual rights. So I'm hopeful we can eventually get away from some of this divisiveness and push back on some of the claims that the identity left has made, and that people can begin to see some of the flaws in their reasoning. That could happen, and I'm hopeful it'll happen. Will it happen? I don't know. It's difficult to say.
The new book is Against the New Politics of Identity. And Ron, thanks for coming on the show. It's been a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. I enjoyed the conversation.